Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Kelly Brock, and we are going to, with my colleague, Dr. Britton Schnur, we're going to talk about functional behavior assessments. Before we introduce ourselves, since it is a small number, what we were hoping that you could all do is in the chat, write how you like how you're currently working in the capacity, if it's in a school, a clinic, a parent, an advocate. If you could just share that in the chat, so then we are able to gear this presentation in a way to help everyone who's in attendance, since it is a small number. So we'll give you a couple seconds, maybe like 45 seconds to write it in the chat, and then we will reference that.
Hi, Liz.
Hi.
Hi, everybody.
Okay, so we have a fellow BCBA, a parent, a director. Okay. So a BCBA and a school psychologist. Okay, perfect. So we will try to address all of those components and where everybody practices. So I am Dr. Kelly Brock. I am also a BCBA, board certified behavior analyst. I have my license to practice in New York State. I am also a full-time professor of practice at Russell Sage College. This is year 14 for me. I am also the program director of the Graduate Special Education Teacher Prep Program at Russell Sage, along with the program director of the Undergraduate Physical Education Teacher Prep. I actually started as a PE teacher, and then I fell in love with kids with behaviors, and I decided I wanted to change my track. I also am a certified clinical trauma professional. I am a behavioral and educational consultant. I consult with over 50 schools now, and then I am also a safety care trainer, which is equivalent to TCIS, CPI, Handle with Care, all of those things as well.
And I'm Britton Schnur. I am a New York State licensed psychologist and as well as a New York State certified school psychologist. I am now full-time at Chelsea Place. I do individual assessments for kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities, and I also consult with, I don't even know how many school districts. When they call, I go. Prior to that, I had been working in the Guilderland Central School District primarily for most of my career, almost 20 years there. I've worked in other local school districts as well. I'm a past board member of the New York State Association of School Psychologists. I used to be their conference coordinator. Had to step away from that for a little bit for some family stuff to care for my parents, but I will at some point resume my work with them, because once you are part of NIASP, you can never leave. It's like kind of like the Hotel California with them. So Kelly and I collaborate with a lot of different school districts, and we'd like to make this as user-friendly as possible today and kind of talk about the ins and outs of FBAs and behavior assessment, our behavior intervention plans.
So we're going to start off with what is a functional behavioral assessment. An FBA, it means that it is the process of determining why a student engages in behaviors that impede their learning, and then how the student's behavior relates to the environment. So we're also, with an FBA, we're also looking at those environmental factors that might be occurring within the classroom, within the cafeteria, within special area locations, and also on a bus. Like the transportation could also be an area that's discussed. I have written an FBA for specifically bus-based behavior, so we have done that before. It's not as common, but that is still part of the educational process that we provide students. Additionally, with an FBA, in layman's terms, how I like to explain it, it is a collaborative process of gathering information to attempt to understand the purpose and function of an individual's behavior, and it has to be collaborative. That is one of the biggest things I push for. I end up normally doing about anywhere from 40 to 60 functional behavior assessments in a school year. So this is kind of my wheelhouse. I'm a little bit of a nerd.
Just jumping in on that, Kelly, too. We're going to talk about the timeline in a little bit. And I agree 100% with Kelly that it has to be a collaborative process. One of the things that I've seen schools get caught up on, though, is having everybody at the table at the exact same time. And sometimes that delays getting the process started. So while it has to be collaborative and everybody has to be part of it, everybody doesn't have to be part of it all at the same time. So kind of functionally speaking, we can get started on it have other members contribute to it, have other members add to it, and it can be developed. But I've had situations where districts are like, well, we can't even start to meet on this for 4 weeks because we can't get everybody scheduled at the same time. So while it does need to be collaborative, it doesn't need to be simultaneously collaborative at all times.
Correct. And the further definition of the FBA is it provides information in a way that helps the student develop new, appropriate replacement behaviors that are more efficient and effective at getting the student what they want in a more appropriate manner, which then is outlined within the behavior intervention plan. Students cannot have a formalized behavior intervention plan without a functional behavior assessment being completed first. Go ahead, Britton.
Okay. So when would an FBA be warranted? So this would be per New York State regulations when a student with a disability is presenting behaviors that interfere with their learning or the learning of others, despite, and this is an important point here, despite the school-wide or classroom-wide intervention. So this is when the child's not responding to all the good practices that are already in place, and they need something above and beyond that. The second one being that when the student's behaviors place the student or others at risk of harm or injury, we're not going to, if they're throwing chairs and they're throwing desks, we're going to need to intervene on that right away. When CSE or CPSE is considering a more restrictive program because of the student's behaviors, and or when the student is having disciplinary actions against them because it could be hypothesized that those behaviors that they're engaging in is related to the student's disability. It's incumbent upon us to say, okay, do we need to be doing something different? And how do we get to what that is? The how of that is the FBA, is looking at all of those dynamics.
For the regulation language, we're just going to kind of skip over this. This is in there for you, how it is directly related in section 201 and how FBAs are considered. But it's kind of what we just summarized in a much quicker, easier way. So one of the questions that I commonly get is, does a student have to be identified for the student to receive an FBA, also known as a student with a disability? Does that student have to be identified in order to receive an FBA? The answer to that is no. We can do an FBA for a general education student, and we would do it in the same manner that it would be completed for a student with a disability. So this is a big piece. So a lot of times when I'm talking to different parents, advocates, sometimes school administration, not necessarily the special education administrators, but the general administrators, they'll say, I'll bring up, well, have we done an FBA on this student? And the individual who I'm talking to might respond, well, no, they're not an identified student. My response is, they don't have to be an identified student. The purpose is to figure out what is the function of the behavior, what is the environmental context, the contributing factors, the antecedents, what can we do? So we can do an FBA for any student, even if they do not have a disability.
So an FBA is based off data, and I'm a school psychologist at heart, and I love data probably more than is healthy. Like Ellie said, I'm a little bit of a nerd too. And data is not just numbers. It's not just plots. It's not just, although graphs and plots are nice, it's coming from multiple sources because you never want to make a decision based on only one type of data. So we're looking at indirect sources. So these are interviews with teachers, related service providers, outside service providers, the student themselves, looking at different rating scales, things like the FAST I use all the time. Sometimes other rating scales that are more clinical in nature and less behaviorally driven, something like the BASC or the SRS. This would be something where I'd use those if I suspect that anxiety is a big part of it, if attention's a big part of it. I kind of want to get some clinical numbers about that. We're also going to want to look at a record review. Is this new behavior? Is this did something traumatic happen and now we have a new set of behaviors? Is this brand new behavior because we've reached the student's capacity, or has this been building over multiple years? That's going to help us understand things and help us better understand the child. We're also going to do direct observations. We're going to go in there and look at the child. We're going to have ideally more than one person looking at the child. When I worked as a school psychologist full time, going in and doing the observations was one of the most helpful things that I could do for the team because I didn't have another agenda while I was in there. I wasn't managing behavior. I wasn't instructing. I wasn't, worrying about the schedule. I could go in there, sit back and look at the child. Not that the teacher wasn't capable of doing that, but he or she had so many other demands on them that they couldn't observe it objectively. So a lot of times in my direct observations, I was able to catch a lot more of the triggers that were flying under the radar. We're also collecting data. We can talk about this a little bit more as we go on, but data collection can be done in a million different ways. Like some people get very set on it has to be collected in this very certain way. It has to be this form or that form. Kelly's going to share a whole bunch of different forms that we use. My take homes with data collection are it has to be user friendly and it has to be accurate. So accurate and precise to me are two slightly different words. So some teachers will kind of give us some pushback sometimes because they couldn't possibly catch every single behavior. So if a behavior is happening, say 800 times in a day, and you tell me it's happening 790 times in a day, that's pretty close. That's accurate, maybe not precise. If you tell me a behavior is happening once in a day, but it's actually happening 5 times in a day, that is inaccurate data. So we have to be very collaborative when we're working with our teachers, and we have to give them a system to record this information or record it in such a way that it's accurate and meaningful, because it's not just about collecting numbers. We're using these numbers and these data points to benefit children. And that's the biggest takeaway. So if tally marks are easier for this group, or a checkbox with things already listed out is easier for this group, we can be flexible in that as long as we're getting that information. The other piece that we do sometimes along with the observations is they're not just narrative. They are both quantitative and qualitative. So I would go in, for example, and I would record how I would do the data collection. I would record the percentage of time on task. I would record the negative bids for social attention. I would look at that. And you could either do that per child, or you could do that with the child compared to other kids in the classroom. So if the child's only on task 30% of the time, that may seem like a huge issue. But if we're looking at it and the class is only on task 35% of the time, then maybe we need to talk about things like instruction and classroom management and things like that. But if the children are on task an average of 90% of the time, and my target kiddo is on task 20% of the time, then I'm going to be looking at more individualized interventions at that point.
And what I'll add to, just for some of those clinical scales, so the SRS, the social responsiveness scale, I have been using more recently, especially for my kiddos with autism, where one of the interfering behaviors is their social ability to interact with others. So I have had normally the parent fill it out and the school member, and sometimes two school members fill it out, so that I can really see, are we all getting a clear understanding of how autism is affecting this individual socially and the different components of all of the social cognition that is going on, which then also helps to make some direct correlations on why they are having these behaviors in a certain area, because we know kids with autism have a really hard time with perception taking, reading social cues. So that is a really great scale that I've been including a lot within some of those FBAs for those individuals. And then also with the comparative data that Dr. Schnur is talking about, I will go in when I'm doing the observation, and I will have my own little data sheet. And what I do is I don't pick the same comparative student. I switch it up, because what happens if I pick the worst student in the classroom, or what happens if I pick the best? So what I will do is, as I'm in there, I will use comparative data for a lot of times prompting. How much prompting is my focus student getting versus other students? And I just call it female student A, female student B, male student A, or numbers 1, 2, 3. That's been really helpful, and parents actually tend to really appreciate that as well, because when the data comes out, sometimes, in my most recent one that I just did, the student that I'm doing the FBA on is actually really comparable to some of the other kids, and sometimes the other kids are getting more prompts than them. So that has been one piece to FBAs that I've really started to implement, along with the time on task I've also used as comparative data. So without data, we don't have an FBA. That's pretty
story.
much,
It's just a story.
That's what it is. We have to have that. So the outcome of an FBA is clear and comprehensive data that indicates, here's my antecedents, here's my consequences. I also like to include a section on skill deficits, and I call it skill deficits / lagging skills. And for those of you who are familiar with Ross Greene's work, that's where I'm getting it from, to kind of help people understand, like, the student has difficulty with concentrating. They have difficulty with accepting change. They have difficulty attending, shifting perspective. That gives a lot of information on the student's profile. We also talk about setting events. Some of us might have heard about like seasonal effects of students. Once winter hits, we see an uptick in behavior. We can also have other setting events such as they're not sleeping well, or that would probably be more of a contextual factor, but setting events could also be where they're located. The cafeteria is really hard for them. So we just want to make sure that we're targeting what are the components affecting the behaviors along with the behaviors, and then what's going to be our path for the development of a replacement behavior. Not only do I have to find the function, but I have to find a path. Go ahead.
And I think, as Dr. Brock is saying, that this is a really important piece too, because this is sometimes when we get that feedback, well, sometimes he can do it. This is a choice. He's choosing to misbehave. The setting events, the contextual factors really help us understand what's happening for the child. Because if these behaviors are only happening, we used to have one child, it was like between 107 and 112, the behaviors would kick in. And that ended up using that information, then sharing that with the outside providers. That ended up helping us because it was a medication issue and it was a rebound effect. But if we say that it's all misbehavior all the time and we're not looking at it functionally and contextually, that can really limit our understanding of what's happening with the child. And more importantly, it limits our ability to think creatively and think practically on how to intervene to replace these behaviors with something that's more functional.
So we do have a question in the chat before I finish this slide, because I just saw it. It said, should parents be getting a copy of the observations done when someone comes in to do an FBA? I include the observation report directly in the FBA.
Yeah,
so
same.
I will take my narrative. I don't write it in the FBA because I haven't created it yet, but I write it in Word, and then I literally copy and paste it right into the FBA. So you would get a copy of that because it's going to be part of the FBA.
Yeah. And then when Kelly and I do them collaboratively, I'll send her my observations and we just kind of pop that into the document.
Yes. And it's part of the data that is helping us to come up with a conclusion. So it will be in the FBA. The additional outcome of an FBA is determining the function of the behavior. There's 4 functions of behavior: sensory, also known as automatic reinforcement, escape, attention, and access to tangibles. And access to tangibles can also be access to a person, a place. It does not mean I need access to an iPad. I need access to a specific toy that I want. It's also people and places, because we might have a behavior that starts as an escape, but really the end goal is they're escaping to get to the counseling office, or they're escaping to get to the main office, because once they get to the main office, they get to talk to their favorite office staff, and then they get candy. So like we start to figure out all the reasons on why they're doing that. The FBA will also, if it's determined necessary based on the data, it'll also trigger a behavior intervention plan to be developed for that student. Then lastly, again, it acknowledges those potential lagging skills or areas of need requiring direct intervention and or teaching. And we'll talk about in a bit, I include a teaching section. This is how we're going to teach the replacement behaviors, teach those lagging skills. This is how we're going to help support that student.
So how do we start? First, we have to get consent. So everybody has to be on the same page that this is something that we're doing. This is something that is outside of what happens to general education students within the school day. So we need parental consent on this. So the school has 10 days to provide consent once it's requested. Once consent is received, there's a timeline of 60 calendar days. So if it's thought that the FBA can't be done within that time, we can request extensions, and then the new consent is signed and it starts the clock over again. Since the FBA is based on data, you have to have enough time to collect it, analyze it, and report out. And this is where theoretical me and practical me always had a hard time because of, kind of living in the school environment. This is a perfect plan from a theoretical, let's figure this behavior out, let's really study this, really analyze it. 60 calendar days while you're in school and you're dealing with these behaviors feels like a lifetime. That is, so if you think about 60 days in comparison to the 300 days that kids are, calendar days that they're in school, that's an enormous chunk of the school year. So we always want to balance it between doing it well and doing it quickly. So that's why I was saying earlier, where it's a collaborative process. It absolutely has to be, but we have to sometimes be flexible in that. So if, you know, 3 of the team members can get together, then we start this process and we start creating it, and then other people add in. We use, just practically speaking, this is a great use of things like Google Docs, and we're going to have an ongoing conversation. We're collecting more information, we're refining it, but just because we have a lot of time doesn't mean that we need to, it can wait, because when the child is, and even if it's not dangerous behaviors where the child's throwing chairs or things like that, if they're screaming a lot, if they're eloping a lot, that is 60 days is a lot of time and resources in a school day. So we want to try to get this done as authentically and accurately as possible, but in the shortest amount of time. The other piece of this is these FBAs are being done because the child's struggling, and letting them go and struggle longer and longer. Then I put my trauma hat on and say, okay, what are we doing here to this kiddo? So we've got to intervene appropriately and effectively, but we also need to do it as quickly as possible.
So following consent, Dr. Schnurr started to already talk about this. The school team meets to discuss these are the target behaviors to what to collect data on. Most of the time, if we already have consent for an FBA, we know what the targets are going to be on. But I have also had to do FBAs where, you know, we're not really sure what the target behaviors are. So a lot of times, or I'm a brand new person coming in, before I directly start collecting data, I like to do an observation. Then I'm picking out, here's the target behaviors that I think are going to occur. And then we start to collect the data on that. Once I get the target behaviors, I operationally defined out what that is going to be. What does that look like? So if I just say, I try to avoid general statements most of the time as like interfering behaviors. That could be a lot of behaviors.
Mhm.
So I like to try to be, I might do a category as physical behaviors towards others, and then I outline that. For some kids, I might do distracting behaviors, but then I know these are what the specific distracting behaviors are. I avoid temper tantrums as a target behavior. I think that's really hard to define, so I would break that down into other behaviors. If it's elopement, I very specifically state what elopement is. Elopement for me is not them getting up out of their seat. That's leaving the designated area. Elopement is more of they are exiting out of the building. It could be they are exiting out of the classroom, but I also include sometimes wandering, or really I focus on leaving the designated area because it's not always going to be a classroom either that they're expected to be at. The school team then determines the methods to collect data, just like Dr. Schnurr referenced, where she said, I need to know what's going to be functional and practical for you to collect data on. What I've realized throughout the last 16 years doing this, if I am asking a general education teacher to collect data and they are the only adult in that room, I cannot normally get frequency level data because that's so specific. I might turn to scatter plots. I can't ask them to do an ABC that asks for narrative and recording. They can't do that. So I will switch over to scatter plots, and you will have an example of that. We also talk about the direct observations. When is the most appropriate time to observe? And sometimes if I know behaviors happen at a specific time, I'm going to want to get in and observe during that time. But there's times also where I might want to see how they do during non-identified times, just so I can also write about that. Or I can just also rely on my interviews and my data collection to indicate that those times are not times where the student is struggling. We also interview all the relevant individuals, which we talked about. If it is appropriate, I talked to the student. I talked to a student yesterday and he was the coolest kid ever. And it was just so nice to sit down and talk to him. And sometimes when you talk to the kids, they help you come up with solutions on how they think their behaviors could be improved and how we as adults and school staff and parents could help to change those behaviors. And then of course we do the record review. The school team determines who will be the lead in the development of the FBA. Normally, this is school psychologists, sometimes special education teachers, social workers, school counselors. In the regulations, it actually does not state who has to do it. It states that it has to be somebody who is experienced in the development of a functional behavior assessment and would understand the components related to the FBA.
Just a quick jump in. Thinking about, we talk a lot about analyzing during these interviews what the behavior is, what the triggers for the behavior, what the behavior looks like, operationally defining it, what the consequences are. That is incredibly important and a necessary step. Sometimes, in addition to that, what I will do with teams is talk about when it doesn't happen and thinking about what, so that sometimes really brings into focus what those setting events are, what those contextual events are, because that can really help us as far as if it's going to develop into a BIP. When does this behavior happen? And then more importantly, when does it not happen? What has to be in place for us to see more success? So it's a team approach. As Kelly was saying, the law doesn't designate who has to be responsible for it. We just have to make sure that the people that are doing it are trained in it. And it's a team approach. We have to get input for everybody. We definitely need to get, especially in the older grades, some people get really kind of defensive about this. And I'm not asking about this because I think one teacher is better than the other, but I need to know, is it happening in one class versus another class? Because I'm going to look at things like time of day, the student's skill set when it comes to the course that they're teaching, their relationship to female teachers versus male teachers. Those are all things that it's not a judgment on the teacher. It's really more of a consideration of all the variables and the factors that are going into this.
Oh, sorry, it's not moving. There we go. So determining target behaviors, we've kind of already talked about. Most of the time, we're going to go 1 to 3 target behaviors. Now, there has been times where I have gone to 4 target behaviors, just because if we have a student who is really engaging in pretty significant behaviors, then I do want to note what those behaviors are. We already talked about having the clear operational definitions, such as leaving the designated area. A student will get up and take 2 or more steps away from their designated location. This can include walking away, running away, crawling away, going to other areas of the room, such as calming area, the sink, the peers area. So that to me is leaving the designated area. So it pretty much is specific, because I have seen people take data where a kid just gets up and gets up out of their chair, stands next to it, and then sits back down, and they mark that as leaving the designated area every time. And I'm like, they just got up and stretched their legs. Like, I'm not so sure that fits that. Now, if I change this to anytime the student gets up and leaves their chair, then it would count as leaving the designated area. Then what I did is within the handout, I added a handout. This is just examples of what would be definitions for you. Sorry, this is really, I like my screen small, but this just kind of gives you access to what that would look like. Let me get back to the presentation.
And I think this is super helpful too, because when we're talking about, like, 1 to 3 general behaviors, if we're looking at a behavior and when we start the process, we've got 8 different things there. It's often very helpful to refer back to the handout or to kind of have conversations and say, are these actually separate behaviors? Are these more different versions of the same behaviors, such as we probably, hitting, kicking, swatting, shoving, those might be physical aggression towards others. But to try to pull that all out, that can become cumbersome. And we want to make this user friendly, because that's what works best for teachers, which then means that's what works best for children. So as we go, and this is kind of an ongoing developing process, if we go and we're like, okay, well, we've extinguished, most of the aggressive behaviors, but they're still swatting at us or still shoving, then we can get more specific as we kind of define this. But if we come into an FBA and we've got 9 behaviors, that becomes unmanageable.
Yes. Did you want to take this slide, or you want me to take it?
Sure, I can take it. So direct data collection measures, that's kind of what we were talking about earlier, that once we've got the target behavior determined and defined, the next step is talking about how you're going to collect data across days and across settings. This is, you can read the actual the law, but about, Kelly's about right. There are usually about 10 days, give or take. Sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's longer. And we're collecting this information. So if we know what happens in the afternoon, we're probably not going to spend a lot of time collecting it in the morning. We're going to look at different ways. We're going to work collaboratively with the team that's collecting it and finding ways to collect this information in various times throughout the day. So this might be school psychologist, school social worker, school counselor goes in and collects some of it. It may be something where a TA or a teaching assistant does it. It may be more of like the scatter plot that Kelly was referring to. So we're going to be able to make sure that we are collecting accurate information. Nothing is if it becomes so cumbersome that nobody collects anything, then that's not useful. So sometimes we have to try it out. And I've been in many discussions where we are absolutely all in agreement with it. We go to put it into practice and it just, for some reason, there's an obstacle and we can't collect the data in the way we were planning on it. That doesn't mean we don't do it. That means we go back to the drawing board and say, how can we get this information in a meaningful way?
And sometimes I'll also collect data on the interventions that are being used. So sometimes I have students who are not exhibiting behavior, but the consent for the FBA came in. So now what I also do at that point is I do an observation. I call in other people to do observations. Like, am I missing something? Is it just me? Is it my presence? Because sometimes we have that. But even if it's the observer reactivity that might be happening, that's why we have the teacher collecting data. And if we're not seeing any of those behaviors, that's great. I can show that we're not seeing any of those behaviors. But I might also talk about and reference, here's the strategies and supports the school is using. And I use that part of my data collection to help potentially make a correlation of why we're not seeing behaviors, because for the FBA to be requested at some point, there was behavior. So we do talk about that. And state ed does not dictate how many days of data has to be collected. They don't. So it's really just making sure we get an appropriate representation of the student across settings and locations and people to really talk about that behavior. So I'm going to share how some of the examples of what I make on how to collect data. The first one I'm going to share is scatter plots. This is the scatter plot form, and it's one of them that I tend to use and send to teachers. So what it is up here, they would come up with, we would write, here's the target behavior. If it is physical aggression, I might define it out. And I could collect 1 to 3 behaviors on the sheet. But up here where it says description of behaviors of interest, I'm going to do a symbol to help them know. So I would say this, and then I would do the physical behaviors, and I would note physical behaviors. Here, I might say elopement. So then I just make those little signals of what it's going to be. It's just easier to do it that way. I'm not asking for a frequency count in any way whatsoever. All they would do is they would come into it and they would note, they would note that. And then they would potentially, in another one, they would note the slash. That lets me know that within that interval time frame, that behavior was omitted. Now, depending on how it's shared out, it could be an overestimation or underestimation, all depending on how you say it. So how I normally report it out is that if there's 10 intervals in the day and it happened in 5 of the days, that's 50%, but that's overestimating it because I'm not saying it's happening for that whole 30 minutes. I'm just saying it happened. So I very specifically share what that data looks like, but I like it on this 10-day sheet because now it's my whole 10 days for data collection. And if I need to go in and do another observation and I see that the 10 to 11 time frame is when all those behaviors are occurring, I'm coming in at that time to look. And then I'm also talking to the teacher, what's happening at that time? What are you thinking? So that's the scatter plot. That's one of the methods that I use.
And just to jump in on that too, I adjust those times all the time. So my scatter plots would often look like, 10:03 to 10:37, because that's that block of time that thing is happening. So I make sure sometimes I'll do them where it's just the actual 30 minutes. And then sometimes I will block it off that it makes a little bit more sense. So we could say, okay, as Kelly was just saying, it's 11:15 to 11:45. And lo and behold, that's the cafeteria. So that's where I'm going to want to get in and I'm going to want to see it.
Yep. So we can do it that way. Then if I have an aide available, or somebody, or even a shared aide or a teaching assistant, if I have them available, I'm going to try to get more of that direct frequency type data. And then this is something that it might look like. Again, I can have time and or topic. Most of the time, I just want the topic. Like we're doing math, we're doing center one, which is this. As long as I have something that I can go off on, I can start to make any connections to an academic piece to it or a specific activity. Up at the top, you see, I kind of define out what those target behaviors are. Then within it, I have out of seat behaviors tally, independent requests. Like I want to know, is she able to independently request? That's something we're working for them to do. We want them to do that. If there's disruptive behaviors, which I note what they are up top, did they complete the task? Yes or no? Did they put hands on others? Did they escape? Did they have refusal? And then some notes on what might have happened. I also include prompts. The reason why I include prompts is if this is a student who we are discussing the need that they might need a direct support professional, I need to know how many prompts are they taking, and if it's the teacher providing the prompt, or how are we supporting that student right now. So I do that. This one has multiple target behaviors, but it also has positive behaviors. So I do like to share out those positive behaviors. So did they complete the task? Yes or no? Did they have any independent requests? Are they getting that functional language? So I do take this, and that gives me a lot of that frequency data. This one is probably the one that I use most often. I create, it's an antecedent behavior consequence, ABC data collection, the date and time of a behavioral incident. They narrate out the antecedents. I do have some that check boxes, but then I take the target behaviors that we already identified. I put them in here, they check if it's there, and then they put a little tally mark. So now I'm knowing the behaviors, I'm knowing the antecedent, and I'm knowing the frequency. The intensity level, if you scroll down, it's the intensity level is defined, and I actually pull this from the FAST, the functional analysis screening tool. So I didn't make this up. This actually came from a document. That's how we use for the intensity level. Then I ask, what did you try? So what was the consequence after this behavior? And sometimes staff will try multiple events. So I want to list that out, and then you're going to tell me what worked. And sometimes under the interventions attempted, I'll say circle what worked, and then I'll use this what worked as a different column, and then I have the duration. So now what I'm doing with this within this one document and data sheet, I am hitting frequency, intensity, duration, and that's what state ed is looking for you to be able to report out on those behaviors. So I do like that sheet. If I have a student that's spending time out of the room, I have a data sheet like this. What's the student's name, the date, the time they left, the time they came back? Was it teacher or student directed? Because if it's teacher directed, I kind of need to know that. Like, why is the teacher continuing to send the student out? Or if it's student directed, am I starting to see a pattern of behavior that they're constantly leaving as soon as an academic demand comes on? Or they're leaving when we're transitioning to a movement break? Then where did they went and who was with them? So we're continually progress amounting to that. I've also done data for time on task, and this might be what it looks like. And I do kind of break it down. And this one has an example. So time of the day, what was the activity or the subject constructing a paragraph, duration engaged in the activity, 2 minutes, the amount of work requested versus the amount of work completed. They had 4 tasks presented. They did 0. Who was the student with? You write it down. And then comments, only wrote 1 word down on the graphic organizer. Okay. That gives me a little bit of information on what's going, and I can really dissect it further. Then I also have, this is a sheet that I tend to use more for secondary level students because those kiddos don't always have support staff following them around and going with them from place to place. And they're also dealing with multiple teachers. And I cannot make sure that a data sheet continues to move around. So each teacher gets a copy of this. And I ask them to record across 2 weeks. And sometimes if I don't have enough data, I go for a 3rd week. So what it is this is just an example for a kiddo I use. Distracting others, off-topic conversations, wheeling around, bumping chairs, etc. Did it occur? Yes or no? And then an estimation of it. It occurred somewhere between 2 and 6. Because again, if they're teaching a whole class, they can't get the exact count. I do the same thing with calling out, defiance and refusal. And then that one's time-based. I make that minute-based because they could refuse 1 time and it could last the whole entire class. Or they could refuse 10 times, but each time is only 30 seconds. So I do it more along a whole minutes, and then the estimated numbers of prompts and the estimated percentage of work completed. And this would change for each student that I'm working with, but I do tend to like the estimated percentage of work completed at the secondary level, because sometimes a kid could be having a whole bunch of distracting behaviors, but they might still be doing most of their work. So I want to make sure that we're acknowledging that. And then within this, I have three. So on 3 little sections on one sheet, the teacher can fill it out. So I normally get 2 or 3 back from each teacher that they do it. So this has been the one that I've been really successful with doing at the secondary level. And when I report out the data, I just take the median number. So the 6 to 10, I'm going to report as 8. And I put in my analysis under the tables that I create. I put this is a median number because taking the median within the range is the most appropriate measurement to get a accurate reporting. So I do talk about that. So those are some of the methods that I use for data collection, and I use many other ones too, but I figured those were the easiest ones to show, to explain, so that you can see how we can differentiate data collection to support students.
So the direct observations, we talked a little bit about this already. It can be completed by one person. It can be completed by multiple people. Generally, as a rule of thumb, 1 to 3 observations, because there's absolutely the observer effect. I would walk into a classroom and they would be fine. Like we would joke like, oh, we just need a wax cutout of you in there because they're fine every time you come in. So looking at the observations over time, between 1 and 3 observations, the time frame can vary. I'd say a minimum of 30 minutes to up to 4 hours. If we're doing 3 observations, 4 hours each, and we're not seeing the behaviors, then either the behaviors, something's working and it's preventing them, and we need to have that discussion, or it was more of a transient situation, and we can talk about the supports in place to prevent it from happening again. Narrate what's observed, include behaviors, provide comparison to other students while appropriate, and we can also be sampling the frequency count. When we're narrating the student behaviors, it's really important to operationally define them and not place judgment on them, which is actually harder than it looks. So, the student was disengaged from a task. Okay, well, what does that look like? So I would say things like the student appeared to be disengaged from the task as evidenced by, scrolling on their phone, looking out the window, doodling on their sheet. And then I will also sometimes come back and, it seemed that the student was disengaged from the task as evidenced by these behaviors. However, when called on, was able to provide an accurate response, indicating that the student had in fact been attentive. Because some of our kiddos, especially our kiddos on the spectrum or our kids with anxiety, which often are the same child, they will look very inattentive. They will look very disengaged. They will be staring out the window, but they're absolutely processing that information. So it's really important we don't want students to just look, and what our opinion is as attentive, we want them to actually be attentive. So sometimes I'll talk to the teacher ahead of time and say, hey, I'm going to be in here. Can you cold call on this student so I can get a sense of what's going on? Or if they raise their hand, can you be sure to select them to answer, because I'm going to want that information.
Yes, and sometimes too, when I'm doing a narrative, I very much will sit there and I will note the student got up and left their seat. It should also be noted that at this time, 3 other students were out of their seat, or the student stood up and stretched. 6 other students were out of their seat. So that it's not looking like I'm there focusing on one student, but let's also lay out what the classroom looks like. And I'm not trying to get anyone in trouble. I'm just trying to provide some comparative means. And when I've done that, most of the time, parents have very specifically said, I appreciate that. I appreciate that because that provides some normalcy, and it doesn't make me feel like my child is really bad.
And then, other to add on to that too, is like, if so the student stood while they worked, but were engaged and attentive to the task. That's super. They're out of their seat, but they are on the back carpet and they're stretched out and they're more attentive. Those are really important pieces of information. Or the student got up and stretched, and that helped them regain their engagement into the task. So those are important behaviors too, that we're not being so behaviorally oriented that we're not talking about the things that the students are doing themselves to self-regulate.
Yes. So for indirect assessments, we've kind of already talked about that. Britton noted that she does the functional analysis screening tool, the FAST a lot. I actually do the QABF probably the one that cat is not going to leave me alone, so he's going to have to come up there. I actually do the questions about behavioral function form a little bit more. And with the questions about behavioral function form, there is actually 5 functions that they're talking about. One of them is directly related to physical aspects. So like, are they not feeling well? Are they tired? Are they injured? Which is sometimes a contributing factor. So I do like the QABF. We do those student, parent, teacher providers, outside providers. We do interview all of them. It's not a requirement that the parents are part of the assessment, but it is best practice. So it's not always a requirement that we do the parent interview, but it is best practice. There's only a few handfuls that I do not do a parent interview on. And sometimes I just can't get a hold of the parent. But most of the time I try to have that, because anyways, you're going to end up reviewing the FBA at the CSE anyway. So it's really helpful to have a conversation with them, and nobody really knows their kid better than the parents. So I do try to do that. We also do the record review, which we already talked about, and then those behavior rating scales also occur as well.
So the antecedents, what is triggering this? So these would be things like transitions, demands, being told no. One of my favorites is being interrupted while they're working. So they finally get engaged and then we have to move on to something else, or they're interrupted. The setting events, recess, less structured areas, morning arrivals, specific peers, those physiological events, not feeling well, or for our anxious kiddos who seem fine, but they're role playing it in their head, and this could happen, and that might happen, and this happened, and I'm replaying this negative event. Or cognitive abilities, academic strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes these behaviors happen because this child is functioning at a level of frustration all day long. They are being asked to do something that they have lagging skills on. They're being asked to do something that they're not developmentally ready to do yet. So those are important pieces. I think Kelly's point is so important on the antecedents and talking to the parents, because those are the things where I can't tell you the number of times that I've talked to parents and they said, I knew I was going to get a call from school because I knew he just woke up and he was upset, or she was so anxious getting out the door, I could barely get her on the bus. That's incredibly important information, and that's incredibly meaningful information for the school team and for the child, because if we know something's happening, then we can when we're developing that behavior plan, a phone call or an email from the parents is saying, hey, just a heads up, had a really rough morning. Well, that can turn the team into, well, all right, we know that this is one of their antecedents from the data that we collected. So we're going to go into an easy start this morning. And I'm not going to hit him with a math test when he walks through the door.
Yes. So other required information per the regulations in a functional behavior assessment is, number one, the identifying information. Who is the student? Like, we need that information. We also need the student's preference, interests, what is motivating for them. Some people like to do a forced choice assessment. I like to talk to parents. And then there's some things that parents might say, well, we do give him his iPad at home, or he gets to play this specific game, or he gets access to this stuffed animal that he carries everywhere. Sometimes we can't do that in school, but it's still nice to know this is what they like. And there's many forms of reinforcement surveys that are out there. We also talk about what could potentially motivate the behavior. So I have a section in my FBAs where I talk about what is the motivating factor. Well, they're able to escape the task. They're able to escape and gain attention. They're able to gain access to what they like. Or sometimes they just enjoy doing it. It's a sensory component. It's automatic reinforcement when they do that. So I lay that down. I'm not saying that's the exact hypothesis yet. I'm saying these are things that motivate the behavior because they like them. It makes them feel good. They're getting something that they want. Also required is noting, here's the consequences, and I don't mean that in a putative way, but here is the consequences or the strategies and supports that the school has tried or are currently in use, because it is not a one-size-fits-all for behavior. I really wish it was, but it's not. We also have to have the hypothesis in there. And then there's a section at the end that I write that says recommendations. And then that's where I talk about what are the next steps. Do they need a BIP or whatever my specific recommendations are. Optional components to put in, which I already talked about, is I do the lagging skills component, and I kind of reference Ross Green's work. I also sometimes, depending on the student, will put an antecedent behavior consequence flow chart. So here's when these antecedents happen, here's where the behavior is. I will mainly do the ABC flow chart if it is a student where his behaviors might start with verbal. And if we don't get it in time, then it's going to get up to some physical behaviors. Then it might get to property destruction. And then it might get to injury to self or others. I like to put that down so whoever's reading the functional behavior assessment can see there's a pattern to his behavior and he continues to escalate, and then what the consequences are. I also put behavioral goals, and then of course the results of the behavioral rating scales that are used. I do like to put those also in the FBA.
So as Kelly was alluding to, consequences doesn't mean like this happens and then we respond with this. These are what the behavior is causing, the result of the behaviors. They can be both planned and unplanned, intended and unintended. Things like planned ignoring is often a consequence of a behavior, but that's when something like the data collection with the ABC chart is incredibly important, because planned ignoring is incredibly useful for some kids, but not for the kids that we know escalate as soon as we start seeing the verbals. Prompting and redirection, the environmental setups, what is the reinforcement set of systems? What kind of choice is given here? Is this a child that is driven by they feel very anxious, or they're very self-directed, and giving some choice will really reduce this? So these would be things I would say, like, okay, here's math. Do you think you can do 3 problems or 5 problems? So sometimes things like that can really be helpful. Or how about we try one problem and then we regroup and see if you can do another? Checking in with the students, especially with our older kiddos, that's also incredibly important. Like, that's where sometimes we'll use like the zones of regulation. Like, where are you feeling right now? Like, how are things going? Are you feeling on edge? Do you feel like you can do more of that? And sometimes just the simple acknowledgement of checking in with a kid enables a kid to do more than they would have been if you don't have that kind of, almost taking their temperature.
And these are just some examples. So sometimes I have a laundry list of things that faculty have been doing, and that's really helpful for me because I travel from school to school. So I'm not just in one school, so I don't know what all of them are. So I often, in my conversations with teachers, and sometimes this is why I talk to a lot of different teachers, and I can't normally get them at the same time, like Britton noted, we just can't. But I can start to see, all right, okay, so I don't want to talk about this because it seems like 6 teachers have already tried this strategy and it hasn't worked, but I still like to note it down. So this is just some of the more relevant ones. So after getting all the data, it's time to analyze and then create the hypothesis to generalize or generate your recommendations. So with the analysis of the data, I like visuals. I normally do charts and tables because I feel like people they can read about it. Like, I can do a quick little summary, like, oh, this was the duration, but I also like to see it across dates and times. So I'm just gonna this is part of a training that I do. So I just kind of made it. So like, here's what one of them looks like. So this is daily time on task. And I just write the minutes. And then if somebody looks at this, you guys are probably thinking, wow, this kid's all over the place. He gets 105 minutes on task, and then the next day, 294. So this is unstable data. And then I do a little explanation of what it looks like. Then I have a data graph on antecedents. Okay, we can really see the teacher talking is the trigger. Now, this is a problem because the student needs to be able to tolerate a teacher talking. So, we're able to break that down. Here's another one with time out of the room, and you'll see I have total time out of the room and then the time spent sleeping. And then under the narrative, I explained like these tend to go together because when he's out of the room, he tends to fall asleep, which we can see here on the 3rd. He was out of the room for 75 minutes and all of that was spent sleeping. Same thing on the 18th. And then he didn't sleep at all on this date. So a lot of different data, again, based on it. Here's where I took this data, the sleeping, the time out of the room, and I broke it down further into what activity. So when I look at this, I see, okay, morning work. And he's only doing the sleeping during 3 tasks, which is actually really good because now I can focus my interventions and supports at that time. I also realize that it's morning work, so he's probably not sleeping so well at home. So we're able to generate a plan for that. And then, and these are all coming from a little bit of different kids. Here's one on total daily aggressive behaviors. Within the document, I've already operationally defined what are aggressive behaviors. And if you look at this, you're like, whoa, okay, the 29th, 30th, 31st, and 1st, 4 days in a row, he's pretty high. And then he drops immensely. And what that triggered me to do was when I had my conversation with the parents was to ask, did something change? Yep, we put him on meds. Thank you. Now I have the data that correlates with that. Like, those are some significant drops. Then I have the behaviors per time frame, because I think that's important, because people will say, all right, yep, at that time, he's having 125 behaviors, aggressive behaviors. When? This is when. And when we look at it, we can see here, it's pretty consistent across the day, pretty much, it's happening at a normal rate. So we talk about that. Then I do some verbal behaviors, what it looks like, the threats, the inappropriate language, others. And then I might also do the narrative of this was what happened, this was the incident. So I might carry over some of that as well. So just some examples. If I have someone who's not attending classes, it might look like that. The absences from class while at school, I break it down by subject. So just different things that you can look at. I also like to make tables. So that secondary level data sheet that I told you about, this is how I report out on that data. So because at the secondary level, students change from class to class, I very specifically say, data was collected 6 times in math, here's the date, 753, whatever it might be. Then I take it and I say, all right, here's the total estimated, because remember, they're not exact counts, it's a range, the estimated inappropriate verbal behaviors and distracting behaviors per subject. Here it goes. And it's total distracting over the recording period in math was 34, total calling out was 18. And then we can see, oh, art, okay, he doesn't have any of the other behaviors. Study hall, he's great, or she. And then I just note from the table, we can see the student engaged in this. Then I talk about 2, defiance and refusal. I share how I break that down. And then if there's days with 0, I explain what that looks like. I'm not just trying to report on all the negative behavior. I'm trying to report like, look at this. There were days when the student did not engage in refusal or defiance behaviors. It was this time. It was on these days. And then I go total estimated duration occurred, the prompts provided per subject, and then average percentage of work. So I just take that data sheet and I break it down based on what it is. And I can't do that in beautiful, colorful graphs. I do it in tables because it just makes it easier. And the idea of the analyzation of data is to highlight any trends, develop the relationships, and then there might be outlier data. Like, okay, I know I've had times where science has been wonderful, but then one day, a huge peak in behavior, and it's like, whoa, I then look in, hey, what happened this day? Well, he came into school and he had just found out that, something, his cat was going in or something like that. That's important information because that's not going to happen all the time. So I do look for that data as well.
And then just to jump in on the outlier piece, it's really important because sometimes we'll see there's just this enormous spike in behavior on one day. Oh, lo and behold, there was a sub that day. Or, and then that helps us help the child because we can say things like, not that we can always prevent subs from happening or preset the child, but we can put things in place to say, hey, there's going to be a change today, or hey, let's have another familiar adult kind of introduce the new sub. Let's make sure we put an experienced sub in this classroom. So I think that's an important piece too of looking at those outliers, not to just ignore those. Kelly, you want to go ahead and take this one?
Yep. You want me to?
Yeah, you want to take it?
Yeah, so after we get all the data and we put everything together, we created a hypothesis based on those 4 functions that I talked about. So an example would be when the student is presented with an academic demand, when they are told, no, you list out what those might be. The student can engage in list out the behavior. The student can engage in getting up and leaving their seat. The student can engage in verbal exchanges to avoid or escape the work presented to them, to gain access to something else that they want, a person, a place, an item. I also sometimes, that's just a very general way to put a hypothesis because you can have more than one and it could be hypotheses, but I might also make a statement such as the primary function to the student's engagement in leaving the designated area is escape, with the secondary reinforcer of access to tangibles going to the counseling office because they're getting a preferred adult. So I can talk about, I can have 2 behaviors being the primary function. I can have a maintaining factor. A lot of times with younger kids, a behavior might start as an escape, but then the attention that they're receiving, my favorite is when kids run away and they walk and you see them look behind you and they get this big old grin on their face. And then it becomes attention. The behavior started to escape, but now it's maintained by attention. So the function changed. So when we talk about hypotheses, we really want to go into depth. We're supposed to have a global and a specific hypothesis. I tend to merge them all together so that we can have it that way, but we are really defining what it is. And sometimes if I have 3 target behaviors, each one of those target behaviors might be serving a different function. So then my section turns from hypothesis to hypotheses, and I share out what that is.
So recommendations, what to do. Like we're doing this not to collect data as much as we love it, but the reason we're doing this is because we want to help children. So what do we recommend for the student? Do we need a behavior intervention plan? We don't have to necessarily write the behavior intervention plan here. We just note that it's needed. Do we need specific interventions like tier 1, tier 2 type of things? Sharing what we would think would help them in the classroom. And if they don't need a behavior intervention plan, how do we make sure that these kids are still successful? How are we monitoring their progress? How are we making sure we don't slip back into these behaviors? So this would be a situation where we get called in to do the FBA. The team, you've got to do something. These kids are struggling. We have to make sure something changes. So the team puts their heads together and they come up with some really good ideas that work and that are feasible and they can maintain. And that helps eliminate the behaviors. So we don't need to do a BIP because what's working at the classroom level is sufficient to meet this child's needs. But we really need to still be looking at monitoring the child's progress. Are these interventions going to hold, so to speak? Are they going to, do they wear off over time? So those would be the things that we're looking at there. And then the tier 1 and tier 2 interventions, sometimes we find a behavior and the behavior may start because the child's off task, and then the target child, their behavior gets more explosive and more disruptive. But what we really need to address is things around classroom behavior, classroom management. So that would be more of a tier 1 intervention for all of the kids, because all of the kids might be off task, but only our guy over here is off task and then becomes so overstimulated that they become defiant and disruptive. So we have to kind of think about what their behavior is, as well as what's happening in the classroom at a tier 1 and a tier 2. Tier 2 is really where I see more of those lagging skills being taught. So this might be, managing a quick, 6 to 12 week counseling program about managing the natural frustration that comes with learning something new or something like that, where if we've identified a very specific area, or coping with anxiety throughout the school day, where we can do some more intensive but short-term interventions.
And if there's no BIP, what I tend to do is I say I'm not needing the BIP, but I will very specifically outline the supports that I do believe that student needs. Mm-hmm. So some common questions we get with functional behavior assessments, and I'm just going to kind of go through this a little bit faster, is 1, how long does an FBA last? That is a loaded question. It does not say in the regulations how long. It's not like a psychoeducational evaluation where it needs to be updated every 3 years. It's really going to be dependent on a whole bunch of variables. An FBA is based on environmental aspects, contextual factors, and if the behaviors change. So if all of a sudden I have a new behavior that has just started to emerge, but all of the other behaviors are still relevant to the student that is outlined in the FBA, I can request consent from the parents to amend the FBA and get data on this new target behavior. Now, if I have a student who has changed classrooms, changed teachers, changed buildings, has new target behaviors, I'm probably going to want to do a new FBA. And if the function of the behavior I think has been changed, I'm going to want to do another FBA. So an FBA can be good from here on out. It could last a couple months, a couple years, 1 year. There isn't anything that says it has to be updated at any specific time. What if a parent doesn't agree? That's going to be their right through their procedural safeguards, if they are an identified student, to have an independent educational evaluation. And this just kind of highlights what that is. So now we're going to transition into behavior intervention plans, and I'm going to let Dr. Schnur start us off with that.
Sure. So a behavior intervention plan is based on the results of the FBA. At a minimum, it talks about the problem behavior, the specific hypotheses, why the problem behavior is occurring. And then this is the important part, the intervention strategies that include those positive behavioral supports to address the student's behavior. So this is like, okay, we all agree on the FBA. We all understand this behavior. Now, what are we going to do about it? So this is like the action plan of the FBA.
Yes, and when must a BIP occur? It's based off the functional behavior assessment. The Committee of Special Education, or the CPSE, is going to have the conversation of, does the student with a disability or not a disability exhibit the persistent behavior that impedes their learning that requires this? If the student's behavior places the student or others at risk of harm or injury, if we are still considering a more restrictive programming, not only do we have to have the FBA, we have to have the BIP to say that we are trying. If they have also been part of disciplinary exchanges or approaches, and we maybe have reached the level of a manifestation determined hearing, then we also need to have a behavior intervention plan in place, and if it becomes the recommendation of an FBA.
So what has to be in the BIP? Everything. We have to put the target behaviors, the data, because the data that we collected with the FBA serves as our baseline to let us know if what we're doing in the BIP is working. The strengths, the preferences, the reinforcements, what is motivating the behavior. So those antecedents, and then what's motivating it. So the antecedent occurs, and then what does the student, how does the student respond to that antecedent? Replacement behaviors, goals. The replacement behaviors and goals are kind of the heart of all of this. So the goal, this is a tricky one too, because it depends on what the behavior is. If the behavior is throwing a chair at a teacher or another student, we need to extinguish that behavior because zero chair throwing is acceptable. If it's something like calling out, and the child was calling out 100 times, it could be very successful still if we reduce that by half, or if we reduce that by 75%. So we have to look at the behavior to think about what the goals are going to be, what the hypothesis is, what the proactive strategies are. What are we going to do to stack the deck in this child's behavior? These are things like seating, timing, all of those things that we can do to prevent these behaviors. That's why that conversation about when does it not happen is so important. What are the teaching strategies? What do we need to be looking at skill deficits and remediation, both academically, student behavior wise, and those social emotional pieces? What are our reactive strategies? Like, what do we not do to make this worse? This is things like de-escalation. How can we bring the temperature down? This is the co-regulation. This is where I talk a lot with teams about the reactive strategies are not immediately going to the consequences, or going to, okay, you don't do this, you're not going to recess. The first thing that we need to do is we need to de-escalate the situation if it's emotionally charged. That might be temporarily suspending in requirements and tasks. That might be sitting in silence with the child. That might be giving space and time in silence. So what are we doing reactively? That doesn't mean that the child's getting out of things. That doesn't mean that we are lowering the bar. What it means is we're taking a pause and we are saying, okay, let's get regulated, and then let's come back to this. So, making sure that the student doesn't have an audience, thinking about whether we're moving the student or we're moving the class. Those are all of those reactive strategies that we are going to be taking from that FBA. And then reflecting with the student afterwards. This is a careful one too, because I got some kiddos that we need to button this up and it needs to be finished and we need to talk about it. And then we've got other kids that, like, we can't come back to this incident right then and there because it's going to re-up the behaviors. And then the progress monitoring. So that's where the data sheets might change just a little bit, but that's where we're still keeping that information. Especially the ones that look at things like intensity, frequency, and duration, because sometimes we don't see movement on all of them at the same time, but we might see big movement on some of them. So they might go from a behavior that's super intense to something that's super mild. And that's progress too. And that gives us information when we're doing our team meetings and we're reflecting on this, of saying, okay, we got some movement in these areas, but what else do we need to do? How else do we need to change and adjust the BIP in order to get further progress on that?
So Part of that laundry list that Britton just shared is that some of those behaviors and required documents, we are literally copying and pasting them from the FBA right into the behavior intervention plan. So most of the time, the behavior intervention plans that I write, normally the first 4 pages is just the copy and paste, because whoever's reading that BIP needs to know the antecedents, needs to know the target behaviors, the data, because that's our baseline, what motivates the behavior, so that they can realize, oh, okay, I don't want to do this because I'm actually just reinforcing the behavior. And then what's the hypothesis? So those are the quick and easy cut and paste pieces to it. So I'm going to take this one, Britt. So what is the flow of the BIP after all required information has been carried over? This is what I do next in it, prior to going through and doing, here's the proactive strategies, here's the teaching, here's the reactive, and here's the reflection. I provide a little table like this in most of my behavior intervention plans. It's not always all of them, but I do it like this because whoever is about to read is now going to understand, here's my 3 target behaviors. Here's my replacement behaviors that I am trying to teach them. And here's the supports and interventions I'm going to use to help them to get to those replacement behaviors. And some of them are going to be the same. And within the behavior intervention plan, I get very specific on what that looks like. So in the verbal behaviors, that first one, I'm saying explicit instruction. And then in parentheses, I'm talking social thinking, which is the social thinking curriculum. Then I'm talking about scripts, which is our language, how we talk to our students. Also antecedent interventions, the use of presets, reinforcement, because I need to implement those in order for the student to engage in functional, appropriate communication. For them to be accepting to apply supports and accept supports. We have some students who, that is their goal. They will accept a coping strategy and a support. They will use a strategy. And then also the replacement behaviors of those antecedent interventions. I need them to accept those pieces. So then I just kind of go through it. Like with physical behaviors, it's using a strategy, functional communication, implementing a job or a break, using a fidget appropriately. So we kind of go through, and this sets the outline for what's going to happen within the behavior intervention plan.
So the proactive, the antecedent supports, this is kind of the heart of a lot of this too. So this is environmental setup, like flexible seating, organization, location, timers. This is when I'm working with my team. Sometimes we do what I call a walkthrough, like, okay, student gets off the bus, student is walking down the hall. What are the things that we're running into? Where's their hook? Is it inside the classroom? Is it outside the classroom? How do they have to walk by that pier, that triggering pier on the way to their seat? What do we need to do here? Visuals. I love visuals visuals all day, every day. Communication can be cards, expected behaviors, checklists, social stories, timelines, kind of flow charts, relationship building. None of this happens. These are tiny little humans. Or sometimes they're really big young humans, but these are people that we need to connect with. Like, this is so critically important. We can have the best FBA and the best BIP ever, but if they don't like each other, that's really hard. So how do we do this? Do we find a common interest? Do we find, inside jokes? Do we do the check-in and check-out? And this is essential. Reinforcement systems, so school-wide, classroom-wide, individual systems. The one caution I will say here with the reinforcement systems is don't make these unmanageable. You can't have 82 different reinforcement systems. They all have to kind of flow together and work together. If you have too many plans, we got to kind of zoom out and say, okay, how can we streamline this and make this more manageable? The reinforcement systems also need to be positive. I am a huge advocate of kids earn things. They don't get things taken away. We're not losing things. There's been, I would say, probably, 9 out of 10, 995 out of 1,000 times, I'm going to tell you that it has to be positive. Every once in a while, kids throw us a curveball. Like, I had a kid years ago who was so anxious about not earning that sabotaged their behavior. So we had to start with it. And then that child did lose, but that's not where I would start with. And within that system, we still had to make it so child friendly. Like they started with 12, but only needed 10 to earn. They had opportunities of learning back because we want to keep this positive. So 999 times out of 1,000, it needs to be positive. And it's just good for morale. Like nobody would go to work every day and be like, you know what, you didn't bring your A game today. Give me some of your paycheck. Like you'd be done with that. Having breaks, when are they planned breaks? Are they as needed breaks? Are they time limited breaks? Are they amount limited? Looking at what that break looks like and for how long. Are they sensory? And be very careful to make sure that sensory breaks are not play breaks. Both can be useful. Play breaks can be necessary, especially for our younger kiddos, but sensory breaks shouldn't necessarily be play breaks and vice versa. Access to fidgets. Fidgets, in my mind, are something that should be pretty neutral. They should be something that the kid likes but not loves. So the fidgets are pleasant, but not necessarily something that they would buy on a shopping spree type of a thing. How and when to contact a parent. You know, sometimes calling a parent can be a great intervention because it can help reset the kid. Sometimes that can be triggering to kids. And using common language, the self-regulation scripts that, you know, big deal, little deal, you know, ready, not ready. Those are the things that if we have those scripts, those give us automatic language to use to the kids, we use with the kids in these stressful situations. Growth mindsets, positive affirmations, having this language ahead of time when we're dealing and we're interacting with behaviors is incredibly important because to be, you know, real and transparent, kids' behaviors are often triggering to adults. You know, we don't go into this in isolation. So having a game plan ahead of time makes us that much more effective when we're working with kids.
And I want to note too that for the reinforcement systems, remember, it's part of New York State Ed that we have to follow PBIS, positive
Mhm.
behavior intervention support practices. So we do start with all of that. And just like Britton said, I am not a fan of a response cost. I will even specifically put it in behavior intervention plans that the student is not to be engaged in a response cost system where he earned points and then he had a misbehavior and we take it away. That's just asking for a power struggle with that
Mhm.
student. Also, maybe 1 out of 100, I will go with a more punitive based system, but I only visit that after we have
Mhm.
tried all of those positive behavior intervention supports. Even if I have a parent sitting there saying, you just got to take this away from them. You just got to do it. Or I've even had a parent tell, we need to spank them. Well, we can't do that. That part's not going to happen. So that's definitely not on the plan.
That's a no.
But what we've done, if I do have to do a system that is a little bit more of a punitive system, I do it as a visual. So I tend to put it as
Mhm.
think of it as a strike system, 5 strikes, 3 green circles, 1 yellow circle, 1 red circle. And then all I do is I remove the circles, and at the bottom it'll say no access to whatever it might be if all 5 of them are removed. I am only doing that after I have tried my PBIS strategies, and at the same time that I might be doing that system, which I have done for students before. I still have a PBIS system in place. This one's not standalone. And I do have those students. I mean, this one student, we spent almost 8 months working with him and doing everything PBIS we possibly could. Didn't work. The moment we did that consequence-based system that made him lose something he wanted, behavior changed immediately. And the dad was like, I told you so. I'm like, yes, yes, you did. But I had to go through this process in order to get there.
And thinking about too, adding on to the reinforcement system, being flexible with that and using that, you know, a lot of times we like to do, you know, you're earning points, you're earning dollars, you're earning tokens, you're earning stars, whatever it is, but you want the kid to succeed. Like sometimes we get in this mindset, like, oh, they didn't earn. We want to do everything in our power to have them earn. We want to encourage them. We want to be flexible with that. Some kids work really well with time limited, like, okay, we're going to see if you earned at this point and this point in the day. Other kids, that causes a meltdown when they don't learn. So they don't earn. So we move to more of a rolling system where they're constantly working like, you're almost there. You're at 9. Just, you know, right after this, you're going to be able to learn again. But that's knowing that individual child, that's taking the data and that's being flexible in your implementation of the positive rewards.
And in the BIP too, be very specific. Like my BIPs are very, very specific because I'm not in the district. So I need everyone to understand what I'm saying. And a lot of the times for reinforcement, I will start it as a caught doing good system. You are reinforcing for anything and everything. And we are just providing all of that positive praise to reinforce those behaviors. So we will do stuff like that. Other proactive antecedent support systems is that check-in, check-out system. It needs to be done with a preferred adult. It also needs to say in the plan how this will happen and when this will happen and how often. Some students are loving to engage in check-out, check-in systems every single day, and they love seeing the kid, or they love seeing the adult. And sometimes it goes for 10 to 15 minutes, too long. Now it's become an escape. So sometimes we have to narrow it down. A true check-in and check-out system has 5 steps. However, there is so much research out there that backs up doing a modified version of that. We don't need to spend that entire time. Sometimes it's as simple as the student comes in, they have a quick, how are you doing today? What are you working for? I'm so happy to see you. Have a great day. 30-second conversation to 2 minutes. So it doesn't have to be anything long. I often will say this will be no longer than a 5-minute conversation. And if I don't have an adult available, I have a backup adult as well. So I do note that within the behavior intervention plan. And that would be something that is going to get changed year to year because the identified people are going to change more than likely. Also with the checkout system, that's something else that you can use at the end of the day, and you reflect, how was your day? How did it go? If they are working on a point or a reinforcement system, this could be their time that they earn. It could also be a reflection time, but at the same time, we got to know our students. If I reflect on something that happened earlier, I do not want to re-trigger it. And I will put that in a behavior intervention plan that we are not engaging in reflection. We are moving on with the day. Additionally, we're going to provide modifications and accommodations, and we're going to list that out because those are proactive antecedent strategies. Remember, a modification changes the goal while an accommodation helps the student reach the goal. So I will very specifically note what those are, and that might also correlate if the student has an IEP to what is listed in the IEP, and that's okay. It doesn't matter if it's listed in multiple areas. It's something that we need to do to help and support that student. We also can offer structured choices. This is probably one of the best evidence-based practices for students who have defiance, refusal, non-compliance behavior. And we get to determine how those choices are. Do you want to do it by yourself or with a peer? Do you want to do it at the standing desk or on the carpet? Do you want to write it or type it? Do you want to do it in a pencil or a crayon? We can be super flexible with these students, and many times students are looking for control. So if I can give them some control, I can do that as well. And I love offering the choices to the students. They normally do tend to pick one of those choices. One of the things that I try to tell faculty is that when we offer choice, we go through our whole choice avenue, and then I might sit there and they're still not willing to do it. One of their choices could be an alternative activity. Okay, so you're not willing to do this. We're going to do it this way. I can also have what I call the WIP folder, the work in progress folder. So, okay, you don't want to do it right now. I'm not getting stuck in a power struggle with the student. All right, why don't you put it in your work in progress folder and we can do it at a later time. And then you can come up with a time. If they're refusing to do ELA for the second day in a row, I can say, all right, you can either do this or we can work in your ELA that's in your work in progress folder. So still giving those structured choices. Alternative activities can be related to the task, they can be not related. Some of the times with alternative activities, it works to decrease downtime, which can be really helpful because downtime is when we can find students engaging in behaviors. I also like to provide jobs as opposed to walking breaks. I love it when kids are like, I'm going for a walk. I spent 2 hours following a girl around a school who was on a walking break. There was no structure. There was no purpose. Jobs are meaningful and purposeful. I need you to go and I need you to go to the office and check in with them, drop this off and bring something back. That's the key with jobs. They have to bring something back to get them back to the classroom. And this is where we can help coordinate with different teachers that, hey, we're just going to have this really empty envelope going back and forth. But if they also might have some sensory needs and they need that proprioceptive input, I can have them carry something heavy, go to the office and get me a couple reams of paper, bring it back down because that's a little bit more heavier. and then we can transition out. That's a meaningful and purposeful job. I also will note in a behavior intervention plan if they need additional processing time, and I will note what that looks like. So you give one prompt, maybe they didn't hear, I repeat the direction, then we're going to wait 30 seconds to 1 minute to allow them to process because their mind could be going a mile a minute. They might just have some executive deficits going on, executive functioning deficits. So we want to make sure that we are talking about that. And then I also talk about presets. Let them know, especially if there's changes to the schedule. Some students don't do too well with handling changes, so I might give a preset. Sometimes I have students who faculty are like, listen, if I give them the preset in the beginning of the day and this happens at the end of the day, they're going to be off for the whole day. So then don't give the preset then, let's give it to them right before the activity. So it's really individualizing it, but the more that we can be specific in a behavior intervention plan, the better it's going to be. So I've read a lot of behavior intervention plans where they have the antecedent strategies listed and it says breaks, check-in, presets, and it just lists them off without saying when or where to do it. In some behavior intervention plans, if I provide a break or a job or the sensory room, I will very specifically state no longer than 10 minutes in collaboration with the OT. But then I will also say it is really helpful if the break happens at the beginning of computer-based activities because that is the trigger, because that's what my FBA showed. So I do try to be really specific with that. I'll just finish this one up, Britt, and you can take the next one. Then the other thing that I'll include in the antecedents is multimodalities of instruction. We don't have kids who learn one way. We have kids who learn multiple ways. And I'm not saying that teachers only have to teach this way, but if I have a kid who likes to move around, I'm going to try for movement-based activities. I'm going to try for sensory break activities. I'm going to perhaps do peer and partner pairing. I'm going to try to get real life situations and project-based learning in. Those are the type of multimodalities of instruction that's going to be really helpful for them. At the same time, if I have a student who does really well with repetitive actions and repetitive learning, I'm going to note that in there as well as a modality of instruction. One thing that I've also been adding to my behavior intervention plans is I request the teachers to make mistakes purposely, because that is going to normalize the idea of making a mistake, because we have a lot of kids who have a fear of failure. They don't want to make mistakes. They feel they have to be perfect. So, oh no, I made a mistake. It's okay. Everybody makes mistakes. Here's how I can work through it. And then we're actually modeling the problem solving approach. We're normalizing it. We're showing that everybody makes mistakes, and then we're problem solving through it. And then I might also put in, if the student needs a transitional item, what that looks like. It could be they hold one of those, like I think of the weighted sloth. I love the weighted sloth. They hold that, they help that in transition. I give them a job for transitions, whatever it might be. And this is only examples. Like it really depends on the student on what those proactive antecedent supports are going to be. And this to me is really the big piece of a behavior intervention plan, is what are those proactive strategies that we can do in an effort to help prevent the behavior from happening, which also would hopefully make them more willing to engage in replacement behavior, such as asking for a break, which might mean a break card. And it might be unlimited amount of breaks, which I don't normally like that, but for some kids, I do have that. And then we can shape that behavior back.
So teaching strategies. So sometimes kids are coming to us and they're lacking prerequisite skills to be successful. So you're going to know how you're going to help the student learn and implement the strategies outlined, how to engage in those more replacement behaviors. So this is also paired with the reinforcement method. So this is sometimes direct and explicit instruction, 5-point scales, zones, second steps, different social emotional learning curriculums, problem solving approach, accepting help. This is another one too. I like to model this a lot. Like, I made this mistake and how am I going to fix this? Who could I call to help? So normalizing that as well. Reviewing social stories, expectations, visuals at the start of the day. I love visuals, especially for younger kids or kids who are more impaired on the autism spectrum. I love visuals with them doing the thing that we're asking, like actual pictures of them. So when we say, all right, I see that you're ready, you can show a visual. This is what it looks like when that actual child is ready. Like I had one teacher that had like a Rolodex of all of the students in her classroom showing ready behavior. And we could just kind of pull those up. Like, and sometimes we use too many words. So we go right to that visual. We point to it like, okay, I need to see this right now. Modeling those strategies, looking at the child's functional language, looking at different ways that their total communication. So this might, some kids, it may be PECs, it may be a device, it may be more nonverbals. In coping strategies. This is also where we use, when I think about tying this back to the processing time, this is where I talk about holding space for a child while they're processing it. So I might say, what would you like to do? And giving them that time to process without adding any more language, but simply pointing to what the options are, maintaining eye contact, maintaining physical proximity, grouping kids with appropriate peer models, prompting, teaching the adults working with them on how to do fading prompts. I really like to talk about it in kind of a 4-step process with, I'm going to be directing it as the adult. We're going to start and I'm going to be doing a lot of it. Then I'm going to be prompting, like, what do you need to do next? How can we do this? Then I'm saying things like, all right, how are we going to do this? And we're making it much more broad, and we're teaching them how to ask themselves these questions. And then that 4th stage is watching and monitoring for that independence and letting them realize that they're doing it on their own.
And I think too, within the teaching strategies piece, this is where I will take and give examples of like a 5-point scale. I will say what that looks like for the specific student. And sometimes I'll take a spin on the 5-point scale and I'll say, instead of it being like, this is what a 1 is, this is how I'm feeling, I might spin it as a 1 means this is a big deal, I can get in trouble. A 4 means I'm probably going to make people upset. And then the language use, if it's the problem solving approach and I need a student to learn how to problem solve, I'll write out here's steps 1 through 5 for problem solving, but 5 can happen at a later time because that's when we come back and we reflect, well, how did this go? Did this work? Did this not work? And I will link, after collaboration with the school team, who's going to take on this responsibility. And if they're getting counseling, then I will talk to whoever that counselor is and say, hey, do you think this is something that you can do in your sessions? And most of the time, the counselors, whether it's social worker, school counselor, psychologist, they're pretty appreciative that, okay, now I have a plan on how I'm going to address these behavioral goals. So I will do that as well. Some reactive strategies, and these are just general supports, is how we're going to use the visuals in a moment. If a kid is upset and they are escalating, I am not going to talk to them. They don't really want to hear my voice anymore. So I'm going to try to rely on some visuals, and that can be visuals from a lanyard, small visuals, pictures of them doing the activities. I've also relayed on visuals where I'll take a blank piece of paper. I will not do a whiteboard because I have been hit with a whiteboard and it hurts really bad. And I will draw a little stick figure person. And what I will do is I will give them a little thinking bubble. And what happens is most of the time, if I put it in front of the student, if they take that thinking bubble and they pick it up and they start writing something in it, we're starting to de-escalate. Now, not everything that they write in the thinking bubble is really great. Like sometimes they write die, like they really don't like me in that moment. But we're calming down. It's a form of communication. If a student is really upset, I'm going to model the replacement language. If they're swearing, I'm mad. I don't want to. And I'm not going to say this. I'm just going to model it. Because again, I don't want to come off combative. I'm going to very directly say, this is the prompting that we're going to do. And at an escalated state, we might start with a very specific model prompt and then work our way down to visuals and gesturals. This is a big deal, I believe, in the behavior intervention plans, and we talk about it in the antecedents, where we talk about how we're communicating with common language. I like the self-regulation scripts by Dr. Tim Feeney and Dr. Mark Uvaslacker. I like them. I like the Is This Expected or Unexpected, which is the social thinking curriculum, so by Michelle Garcia Winter. So I like those as well. But when we get to I'm escalated, sometimes I can't use those scripts anymore. I tend to use active listening. I hear, I see you're upset. And then my best one is, I understand. That is all I say. Now, what I think the student actually hears is, you agree with me, I'm absolutely right, everybody else is wrong. And I didn't say any of that. All I said is, I understand. And I might add in an empathetic statement of, that would frustrate me too, because my job in that moment is to help co-regulate them. I have to be regulated myself in order for me to co-regulate them. So if whoever is responding is not regulated, They cannot be the person trying to co-regulate. I also validate their feelings. And again, limited language and sometimes space and time is your best approach. Nobody, when there escalates, wants somebody directly on them. I had to tell a social worker the other day, hey, let's back up and give them some space. So she did. She backed up and gave them some space, but then she continued to talk and the behavior still continued. So I said, let's just stop talking too, and whoop, went right back down. So these are some of the things that are really important when we're talking about it.
To add to that
Rich.
too, one of the things that I think is coming up a lot, and this is where it gets tricky and we're kind of splitting hairs a little bit. The relationship building is incredibly important and essential. What I really suggest people don't do is make the behavior contingent on the relationship. Please, and I hear things, and it comes from such a good place, but when I hear, oh, come on, please do this for me, I'm going to be so proud of you. If those are things, especially our kids that are coming from a lot of trauma, can be very, very triggering because their approval in that relationship is then dependent on their behavior. So saying things like, instead of saying, oh, doing this for me, or I'm going to be so proud of you, saying, I understand, or you're going to feel so proud of yourself. Those are things that are slight changes in language, but are really, really meaningful, especially from our kids that are coming from a place of trauma. Because if they think that their relationship with this person is dependent on their behavior, that can be a trigger in and of itself.
And then after the reactive strategies, this looks really busy. I'm just going to explain this because I take it from my BIPs. What I do is, because a lot of times I can put all of those things and then staff are like, I don't know what to do in the moment. And if we start with the wrong support first, we could have bigger behaviors. So what I do is I make a chart like this, and I have, here's my, I call it my reactive response chart. If the student does this, here is our response in an escalating fashion. Like, we're gonna start with this. We're gonna do prompts. Here's where my common language. If she does not respond, ask her, what is your plan? Student, I am seeing you walking around. Do you need a break or the bean bag? Like, giving in that specific language, because they could read it all in throughout the document, but they're not always quite sure in what order do we do it. So this is where I break it down for the staff, and they can skip a step here and there. It's not anything like that. This is the guidance of, this is what we do when we hit this level of behavior. And I do put that in each behavior intervention plan.
So reflections, some students are able to do reflections in the moment, and that helps them, and it kind of closes the behavior. Other kids, it re-triggers them. You've got to know your kids to know what to do. But these are the life space interviews. This is the restorative conversations. These are the think sheets. Think sheets shouldn't be punitive. They should be, I kind of think about them as visual roadmaps to kind of processing, especially with our kids that get overwhelmed with a lot of language. Again, we should sometimes it's done. And, sometimes we'd say, this is finished. It's a new day. It's a new time. This is over. And not in a negative way, but in a way that we're saying, okay, you're good here, and let's move on, because then we wouldn't trigger them. We're making a note of it. We're making a note of what happened so we can go back to that. But those are the things that we may kind of backdoor, side door in a counseling session or in a curriculum lesson. Specific scripted language. If we know certain things trigger kids, and like in the middle of an escalation, saying like, okay, if you don't do this, you're not getting recess, that's not incredibly helpful. So thinking about, when we're reflecting, what we're going to do to make sure that we're not triggering it. These are really positive. These, this is what worked to solve the problem. This is what we're going to try next time. In general, unless it's kid specific, again, 99 times out of 100, this should not occur the next day, because if we're holding what's going to feel like a grudge to a kid, or we're going to feel like we're holding a grudge, or we're embarrassing them, or we're bringing it up again, that can be a trigger, and that can ruin that relationship. So every day is a new day. Every day is a fresh start. Unless there's something very, very specific that we know about that particular child, we're going to try to do these reflections in ways that heal and repair the relationship, and make sure we reduce the likelihood of the negative behaviors happening again.
And that's what the new push with state ed and with restorative practices is really going for, is how do we repair the relationship? How do we focus on students learning how to take accountability and avoid punishment and blame on this, but instead say, hey, you know what? I saw this happened. What do you think I can do to help you next time? Because clearly I need to do something too. And I will put that specific scripted language conversation within a behavior intervention plan, because I know that's going to be the language they're going to respond to, as opposed to, well, you did this, what can you do better? No, we know that sometimes they can't process that. So this is what it's going to look like. What we also have to have in the BIP, and this is sometimes not always present. I just make it a table like this. Normally there's little lines in between each box, but for some reason they didn't copy over. But what this is per the regulations, we have to have progress monitoring, and we have to share what that's going to look like. So I always just note, here are the people responsible for implementing the behavior intervention plan. The answer to that is everyone. Everyone at the school is responsible for doing it. I just listed out the person or people who are responsible for monitoring the BIP. I just put who the two normally tend to be, but it could be different in each building, each district. The special ed teacher as the case manager, but if this is a general ed student and they do not have a case manager, then normally it could be the social worker, the school psych, the counselor, somebody else will be assigned to that. How the BIP will be monitored, that needs to be indicated. And you need to monitor the behaviors. And sometimes I will share progress monitoring examples with you coming up. But how we're going to monitor that needs to be included within this as well, along with how frequently you are going to monitor, review the effectiveness of a behavior intervention plan, because a behavior intervention plan is an ever-evolving document. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Something might work for a short period of time, and then it's not as effective. So we come in and we tweak it. So this behavior intervention plan is a running record in itself. So I always normally start between 6, 8, 12, and a quarter of times. Well, 12 is probably the quarter in the school. So then I might go to 16 weeks of this is how frequently we're going to meet with the parents to discuss the progress monitoring and if we need to update the BIP. At the same time, as a school team, we're reviewing it most of the time every 2 weeks to say, here's what our data is. Listen, we're really trying this intervention. It's not working. So then we go back to the behavior intervention plan, and I will just edit it, and I'll put it like a strike through, discontinued on this state, added in this state. And I'm very specific on what that looks like so that we can see we are adapting to this student. And then we can also see the things that are working really successfully for the kiddo. And this is what my running record looks like that I put at the bottom of my behavior intervention plans: the date of the meetings, the topics discussed, and changes made. And sometimes I put things are going really well, there were no changes. Or we added a new behavior, we added a new reactive response, look up in the behavior intervention plan, and then the people that are present. So we do talk about that. I'll just go over this one, Brett, just because it's got my sheets in it. So how to progress monitor. Normally, a scatter plot is the easiest way for progress monitoring. This is what mine looks like when I'm progress monitoring. So behavior 1, 2, and 3, I outline, and then all it is they place a mark in the box if it happened during the 30-minute time frame. And then I take this and I report out on it on what that looks like. Just simple, easy way to do it. I can also use ABC data sheets. So this we are using now for a bunch of different students. It's a little bit of an ABC in a different way that also still includes frequency. So they would put the date up top, the time, the staff member, because sometimes I have faculty say, well, are you noticing this is happening more with this specific staff member? Then we just indicate what was the antecedent, and this is normally just a checkbox or an X. Then we go into the behaviors and staff do tally marks during that incident. Each column is an incident. Then we put, here's the consequences. Was it ignored, prompt, redirected? Then I do the intensity scale, and then they can write any notes. So really quite simple for staff to do. And it gives us a lot of information in that one spot, so I can continue to focus in on it. We can also use for progress monitoring student referrals and suspension, because that is data within itself. Then if I have a student who we're questioning, how is the sensory supports offering them? I have 2 forms that I use. One is this one, which is student name, date, and time, how they were before the break, what they completed, how they were after the break, and then the notes, anything we can share with it. And then the other one is this one. And this tends to be the one I use more now. But what it is I have a scale 1 through 5, and anybody can edit this. You can only get a copy of it though, so you have to download it and then you can edit it. But date and time, oh, it's 11/8 at 11:44. I provided them with access to a fidget. Before the fidget, they were at a level 3. After the fidget, 5 to 10 minutes after, not while they still have it. How did they respond to it? Well, we jumped up to a 5. Oh, okay. Did they have a hard time letting go of it? Yes, they did. So now I'm able to go through and say, and I've had to use this when parents say it's really sensory, it's sensory, it's sensory. Okay, we'll try a lot of different sensory strategies. For one kid, we knew the sensory room was not working. They came out more escalated. So we had the data to back up that this isn't the right approach. So we used this. And then we found out the one that they responded to the most was Velcro, was Play-Doh. Great, we can keep them in the classroom for that. I don't need to transition them out. And then the other thing that I use a lot, and I actually developed it with Laurel Jones. I want to give her credit for that. She was at Bethlehem at the time. So we started on this as a weekly tracking for MTSS and academics, but I have converted it to a behavior tracking form. And what it is I sit there and here's the interventions and supports we are using based on the behavior intervention plan. We might not start them all at the same time because sometimes we can't, that's too much. And then we just sit there and we code how it went using this code. It is subjective, I will admit that right off the bat. But if also the directions, if it happened 1 out of 10 times, all right, we're making some progress. N is no change, it didn't help any time. U was unsuccessful, meaning I gave them a break and I needed to call for more support. Or D, I didn't use it. This is pretty simple and most teachers have no problems using this because it's at the end of the day, all right, did I use this? Yep, I gave them choices. Oh, 50% of the time it worked. All right, that's a P. I'm making progress. And they can add little notes here and they can say like 50% of the time it tends to work. Perfect. This gives me some information, not just on the behaviors, but on the actual supports and interventions. If our supports are working, we will see the behaviors go down. But if we're trying to figure out which supports are the ones working, I would look at something like that along with a sensory programming sheet. Do you want me to take this?
Yeah, take this one.
Okay. How to report out on progress monitoring data. This is just an example. So I tend to, if I'm doing something on a monthly basis, I will like to take all of their behavioral data and I will note like, hey, in September, this is for behavioral incidents. They had 17 total in the month, which resulted in 1 per day, 1.1. And then these were all the days that they didn't engage in any behaviors. Like, this is really good. And then I do it on the same document. So as the school year continues, it becomes a running record. That's one way that I report out. If it's monthly, it's easy, but sometimes it's every 6 months, every 8 months. So then I just call it data set 1 from this date to this date. And then depending on the form of data that I'm collecting, if it's behavioral data, if it's goal data, if it's a mix of everything, if it's prompting level data, I still convert everything to an average because a data set could be 3 weeks, but we might have only had school for 10 days and another 3 weeks I had school for 14 days. So I do average everything out and then I report it because that helps me to sit there and be like, okay, we're showing improvement. And I do break it down by location and or time of day or whatever it might be. So this is kind of an example of what that looks like.
So crisis and elopement, because we can talk about these kind of lower level behaviors, but then, as we all know, there's really intense behaviors. So schools can develop, an intensive crisis management plan or a different document for crisis level behavior. This can no longer include physical restraint or suspension within the document. And just as a kind of a safety measure, noting why there's a medical reason why a restraint could not occur. Although in general, unless the threat is so imminent, and we're not talking about we're talking life and death situations where you would be morally obligated. Other than that, you're not restraining a child. Schools should be developing an elopement plan that outlines with the response if the child engages in the behavior. So this will talk about what it looks like. This will talk about all the proactive interventions, what the replacement behaviors are, what the active responses are. And this is not the elopement, as Kelly had said earlier, elopement is not leaving the seat and they're standing in the back of the room. This is something where their behavior could be dangerous. So the child that's being non-compliant is standing in the back of the room versus the child that's running into the parking lot is eloping. So it's really, it's not, these plans are about the safety and the well-being of the child and the people around them. This is not about compliance. This is not about behavior. This is about safety. So that's when we're talking about these type of plans.
And I will change the presentation, but I just want to note it. Schools must develop a separate document now based on the new regs. It's not can. They must for any type of crisis level behavior because they now need to have policies and procedures in place.
Right.
So I will edit that myself because can't believe I went to edit it. Well, I'm just going to do it now because I'm already in there and it's driving me nuts. Okay. So the other things that I just want to note as we're coming up to 10 minutes left, the FBA, the BIP, and the IEP. What are all these documents? How do they go together? The IEP should have, if a student has an FBA and a BIP, the IEP should have some behavioral goals that can reflect the target and replacement behaviors in the BIP. So most of the time, if a student has a behavior intervention plan, on that behavior intervention plan, there's going to be 2 to 4 goals maybe. And then some of those goals might actually get transferred right onto the IEP as well, especially if we're teaching them coping strategies or we're asking them to identify something within a 5-point scale. The goals on the IEP and the goals in the behavior intervention plan need to be measurable so that I can sit there and say they're actually doing it. It can't be the student will implement a coping strategy. What frequency, how often, how many times are we presenting it to it? So we do need to make those measurables. If behavioral goals are already present at the time of a BIP being introduced and agreed upon, because a key piece is a behavior intervention plan is in draft form until it is agreed upon at CSE. That's a little different from an FBA where once that assessment is complete, it is now a completed assessment. Parents don't necessarily have to agree to an FBA. If you don't, you have the option to request an individual educational evaluation, but with the BIP, it is in draft form until that CSE meeting. And then once that's there, it's there. Now, if I make a mistake in an FBA, of course, I'm going to go and edit it because I don't want any inaccuracies within the report. So that could happen as well, but that would be more of a finalized. I can always go back and add and amend or update the IEP to reflect the new behavior intervention plan. And that normally includes us adding a behavioral goal if there's not one there already or changing them. Then also going into the supports, accommodations, and modifications, supplemental materials or supplementary aids, and putting within that section of the IEP, visuals, reinforcement system, breaks, whatever else might be listed on the behavior intervention plan that we're pretty sure is probably going to work. We can also outline that on the IEP. Now, a difference between an FBA and a behavior intervention plan. Legally, a behavior intervention plan must be reviewed at least 1 time annually. However, in the progress monitoring section, we do note the frequency of when we are going to review that behavior intervention plan. Now, if for some reason an individual who completed the behavior intervention plan didn't put the progress monitoring and meeting of that, it then falls under the notion that it has to be reviewed at least 1 time annually, and that's normally done at the annual review.
So these are just examples of behavioral goals. The student will decrease his engagement in physical behaviors by 30% from baseline data, so 20 per day. The student will take less than 3 breaks per day. The student will attend all classes for at least 80% of the time. Emotional goals might be something like a student will implement at least 1 identified coping strategy, i.e. taking a walk, coloring, listening to music when prompted by a faculty member. The students will be able to identify their feelings correctly when requested by an adult with 100% effectiveness. So those are the different kind of emotional and behavioral goals. Just kind of in practice, some of the things that we do with the emotional goals is like if we take that first one, a student will implement at least 1 identified coping strategies when prompted by a faculty member. That might be a goal for 1 year. And then the following year, it might be the student will identify one coping strategy with fading adult support, and then we'll move it to the student will do this independently. So we're always looking for increased independence in this, but some kiddos need, especially when they're really little, they need that prompting by a faculty member to start with.
And some of the goals that I write will also state the prompting level. So they will be able to implement it following a verbal prompt. Then, like Britton is saying, it's going to drop to a gestural because they might always need that assistance, but I'm also focusing on building independence.
Mhm.
So are we decreasing that prompt level? One of the questions is, so an elopement plan must be separate from the BIP. It does not have to be. Most of the time, I have created making them as a separate document because a behavior intervention plan is focused on proactive teaching, reactive reflection, where an elopement plan is really focused on, it's for the staff mainly. This is what elopement looks like for the student. This is the previous pattern behavior. Here's the replacement behaviors, and here's how everyone's responding. If the phone call comes to the office, it's an elopement. So-and-so is going here, so-and-so is going here. This is the response. This is how we're going to notify individuals. So I have started to create it to be separate from the behavior intervention plan. There is nothing in the regulations that say that it has to be, though.
And that's in these kind of crisis plans too. We talk so specifically, like child will have eyes on supervision at all times. The adult will not leave eyes on supervision until it is confirmed by the handoff adult, and those very specific things. Positioning in classrooms, things like that. So those will be very specific.
Yes, and some important facts when we're talking about behavior intervention plans. A behavior intervention plan trumps the student code of conduct as long as that BIP addresses that target behavior. Now, that does not mean that an administrator cannot suspend. Special education administrators do not suspend. It's building level administration. The principals, assistant principals, deans of students, those are the ones who are able to suspend. But most of the time, if the student has a BIP and it addresses that behavior, we have to follow the protocols outlined within the BIP. Again, a building principal can overrule that at any time based on the safety that the student is presenting and their school community. If a student's BIP does not address a specific behavior, then that's when we would do what we talked about earlier, getting additional consent, collecting data, amending the current FBA as long as those target behaviors are still relevant, and then adding that to the FBA and then adding it up to the behavior intervention plan. If a school district sends a student home due to behaviors, this will count as a suspension. Even if they send them home 1 hour early, it'll count as a full day suspension. 10 suspensions will trigger that manifestation meeting or the manifestation determination hearing, and you will be a part of that as a parent, and the school will come together and answer very specific questions. You want to talk about this one?
Sure. So a truncated day, that's sending the kid home early, starting late, things like that. In general, we don't recommend that. That's not necessarily best practice. We only do that, assuming the child's identified, if the CSE determines it to be appropriate. It limits the child's access to a free and appropriate public education. We do need to offer home instruction and during that time, and it's not allowed to be used as a behavior management procedure. That being said, I certainly have used these things in certain instances, but they need to be time limited. We can't just say the kid's going to come in at 11 o'clock for the remainder of their academic career. It has to be, we're going to do a modified day in coordination with the outside providers while we do a medication adjustment, or we're going to do a systematic desensitization program for a kid who has school refusal and significant anxiety. And we spell it out. We're going to be systematically increasing the child's day. So it's not something that is a strategy that we would use to problem solve. It is a occasionally used tool when everything else has failed to make sure that the child is returning to a full school day. That doesn't mean that we can't offer breaks throughout the day. That doesn't mean that we can't use modifications during the day, but the child has to be in the school at the specific times. I have on occasion done something like the child will arrive 3 minutes after because the bustling of the hall is a very big trigger. So we get them in a few minutes later. Ideally, in those situations where that's the trigger, I bring them in earlier so that they're not missing part of their day. But in general, it's not something that we would recommend.
And with a truncated day, normally if I'm involved in that, and sometimes it happens well before I've even gotten involved, I tend to come up with a criteria so that it's not just left open-ended, like, oh, we're going to do it in 2 weeks. I want to do it when the kid is ready. So I come up with criteria, no more than 2 behavioral incidents in a day, or very specific, but I'm never looking for perfection, because I need them in school and I need them to access their education. So it is 11:59. We have time for a few questions. I know we have limited participants. I saw a couple drop off already, but if you have any questions, we are happy to answer. Otherwise, I think you guys are free to go about your day. You're very welcome.
Thank you.